Our next speaker is Ed York. Ed started, I think, his involvement in nuclear matters as one of the official photographers of the Manhattan Project. But over the years, he's had a very distinguished career at Boeing and otherwise in the design of protective structures. In the civil defense community, his technical expertise is so valued that generally the words that Ed York says it's okay means that it'll work. Probably more knowledge about permanent protective structures for weapons development than any other man in the United States. We're privileged to have him speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Robinson. I thought I would tell you one of my war stories today about one of my adventures in the half-fantasy land of civil defense and national politics. I wanted to talk about the experience or the adventure when I tried to investigate the Soviet system for protecting their key industrial workers. This happened quite a few years ago, and my memory is not perfect. It never was, and it's deteriorating. But how in the world did a farm boy from Kansas ever get mixed up in investigating what the Soviets were doing in industrial protection for their workers? This sort of evolved. For a number of years, I'd been involved in helping protect the United States strategic systems. Aircraft, missiles in silos, missiles in flight, warheads, satellites, communication facilities, underground facilities, and so on. Normal sort of thing that those of us in the survivability business did. From protecting strategic systems, one of the next subjects that we tackled was how to get industry to survive. And unless you could get industrial production back in gear, farm production back in gear, if there should have been an attack, then your recovery period is going to be a very grim time for a lot of people. And so there was interest in this at the time, both within the company that I worked for and within the government at that time. And so it was decided to tackle this problem. And as a start on the problem, I asked for, and what were the Soviets doing at this time? And within a short while, we started receiving stacks and stacks of documents from the Soviet Union that had been translated. It turned out that part of the Soviet program at that time was that every important enterprise. Now, an enterprise in the Soviet system can be anything. It might be a school, it might be an agency, it might be a factory. But every enterprise was required to have a survivability study. And the survivability study ended up as a document. Usually the document was from 40 to 100 pages long. And so I asked for and got the documents concerning industrial protection, since that was the topic of interest at the moment. And after a few weeks, I had a stack of these documents yay high. Most of them talked about relocation. They would move the factory to a predetermined spot. At that predetermined spot, which was presumably out of the target area, there would be foundations in place and utility lines laid, but not necessarily activated. And most of the study would be with the logistics, how many trucks and so on will be needed to make the move, and when it would be done, and all the rest of it. Some of them elected to stay in place. The enterprise made its own decision, not the government. The enterprise made the decision what was the best thing for them to do. The ones that stayed in place then had to come up with some program for protecting their equipment. And there were discussions and diagrams and all the rest of it. Some of their ideas were very good. Some of them seemed to be paper ideas that had never been tested. But scattered in among all this industrial were some information on their civil defense, the protection of people. Not much, but a little. So this is a starting point. Look through the Soviet literature to see what might be applicable to the industries we were concerned about at the time. And it didn't look very hopeful. The main thing that the Soviets had looked at was protection from conventional weapons. Many people have said they were still fighting World War II, and in this case they were. They had good tie-downs for their equipment, they had sandbag protection, but they apparently had completely overlooked ground shock, ground motions, and the things that are of concern close in to nuclear weapons. One afternoon, home on the weekend, had either a good idea or a bad idea, I don't know which, but a way of protecting equipment very simply, very easily, very cheaply. That afternoon, my teenage daughter and I ran some tests out in our garden with a simulated fragile piece of equipment. I used an empty shoebox. And we packaged it a certain way, covered it with a little bit of dirt, and bounced my pickup truck back and forth over it. And the shoebox didn't even crinkle. We had stumbled onto something which we now call crushable material and soil arching. This looked so good that we tried it out on a larger and larger scale within the company. I got the manufacturing research people interested. They gave me lots of good equipment, which I tried to tear to pieces after protecting them this way, and everything survived. This got interest in the government, and we ended up running a whole series of tests, high explosive tests and so on, and surprisingly everything worked. It worked so well that the people started saying, well, okay, we could protect equipment if we wanted to, but what good is equipment without the workers? And so we started looking at the problem of protecting the workers that would be needed to recover from to make the equipment recover and operate. And so I got into the personnel shelter business, what we were going to do about workers. And so then I thought about these few reports on that the Soviets had done on protective structures for some of their people. And so I asked for, what do we know about the Soviet civil defense structures? Not their program, but the structures. What do they look like? And so on. And apparently there was enough interest because within a short while I started receiving dozens and dozens and dozens of emigre reports. Now these are when a Soviet defector came to the United States in those days. They were very extensively debriefed, and everything of interest to whoever was doing the debriefing was taken down and written out. And so I asked for any information on shelter design, shelter construction, and so on. And most of these would be translation from the Russian literature. Most of the emigres did not speak English, and talk about their particular experience in building a shelter or seeing a shelter or what have you. In a few weeks, I had several hundred of these reports from the emigres. And this began looking like a very promising lead of finding out what the Soviet shelters looked like. And along about this time, I got the word was on your next trip to the East Coast, stop by a certain office, civilian office in a business building. There's a man there who would like to talk to you. So next time I was on the East Coast, I went to this address, knocked on the door. A young man there, talked to him. I'd never seen him before. To my knowledge, he had never seen me before. And this is his story. He said he was an architect. I have absolutely no way of verifying that he was an architect or not. He said he had been invited to a conference in Moscow a few months before this. Then he went to this conference, and the purpose of it was on discussing construction techniques, buildings, and so on. He said at the conference, not part of it, but at the conference, they had a table full of literature about their civil defense structural program. And he gave me copies, dozens and dozens of little pamphlets from the Soviet civil defense structure program. Then he said, after the conference was over, he asked if he could go visit some of the new construction that was going on. And so they gave him permission to visit some 5 cities in and around Moscow. Leningrad in those days, Kiev, Moscow. I don't remember the other 2. He said he took his camera. He had a 35 millimeter camera that makes slides. He said he went to the construction sites, and he was interested in factory construction. And so he said they let him wander through the factories. They were building deep underground shelters close to many of the factories. They let him take photographs, he says, of these underground shelter construction in various stages of construction. Most of them were only partly constructed. He gave me all of these photographs. Here I am, a guy a man I've never met. As far as I know, he's never met me. He makes this claim that when we talk about all the troubles of tourists in Russia at that time, were at the height of the Cold War, and yet they said they let him walk around, they let him see anything he wanted to see, take pictures of anything he wanted to see. He gave me this stack of slides taken from his camera. So I take all this information, all these pamphlets about the civil defense program, the structures part of it, which I was interested in, all these pictures, and I go back home, go to work, and look at them. So I wade through all this literature, and what it says was, the literature part of it now, was that in the early 1960s, that the Soviets became interested in shelters for their people. And they presented the problem to the major architectural design institutes throughout the Soviet Union. There were at least 10, I don't know for sure how many there were. They had a competition to design shelters. And after a period of time, it took about 2 years, probably a lot of that wasted in bureaucracy paperwork, but the institutes then submitted their designs for what they recommended for shelters. And there was a review committee. By this time, the Soviets had a very large civil defense organization. And somewhere within this organization was a review committee, and they selected the winning design for shelters. And from all of the variations that the various design agencies had submitted, They took the basic design and said, that's the fundamental design we're going to have for shelters, with 32 modifications. And so you could have a basic design with almost unlimited variations on it. And each one of these came with the detailed construction information that you would need to actually build it. About the same time, the legislation process, or whatever it was, established within the Soviet Union a requirement that every new large building have a shelter for all of the occupants. Now, large buildings were defined as any building 5 stories or more. So that all of the apartment complexes, which normally run 8, 10, 12 stories, every one of those that was built after this edict went in has a shelter by law. And they do. They had a 3-tier system of shelters. One was for the large buildings. They had a separate set of criteria, but with the same shelter design for what they called detached shelters. These were shelters that they put in parks, playgrounds, parking lots, and so on, that were not directly attached to a building. They had a 3rd tier, which was for key industrial workers. Now, this is the one that I had become primarily interested in to get into this activity. The key industrial workers were to be adequate for 80% of the workers on one shift in the industrial enterprise. Industrial enterprise is only one type of enterprise, but for industrial enterprises, 80% of the workers on one shift, these were defined as key workers. So I now asked for information specifically on these 3 types of shelters. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of dealing through the information gathering system that was in place in the United States at that time. The source of information was either the emigres or contacts in the Soviet Union. There's 2 different systems. One of them is very formal, very straightforward, strictly controlled by security regulations. Everything is written down specifically, goes to your contact, it's paraphrased, goes to the next contact, eventually get to the action people. Finally, you get it back, and the process takes several months to do this. There's another parallel process where you tell your contact what it is you want, and eventually you may or may not get back anything sensible from that. And you never know what happens from the time you ask the question until you get an answer. You don't know who's involved, you don't know who the contacts are, anything about it. But I started primarily from the emigre reports and asking for additional information about specific questions on the shelters. Many of them sent back sketches of the shelters they had been involved with. The most common design was in a sub-basement below the building, usually 2 or 3 floors down below the grade level, would be one entire floor. Essentially the bottom floor of a big apartment building would be the shelter. To be called a shelter, you had to meet some very specific criteria. The first was the structural strength, and this was not determined by loads on the structure. It was simply determined by thickness of walls and thickness of ceiling. If you build it thick enough with enough steel in it, it would be accepted. You had to have blast doors. You had to have 2 blast doors in series. which is the best requirement. The blast doors look exactly like the Swiss design thick blast door. As near as I can tell, the Swiss sold the design to France, France sold the design to the Soviets, or the Soviets stole it, I don't know which, but it looks identical, down to the placement of bolts and so on. The shelter has to have blast valves, has to have air supply, has to have an independent water supply and an independent sewer disposal system. In nearly all of the buildings, they comply with everything, but they hook into the city water and the city sewers naturally. As long as that's done, it is not officially a shelter. No matter what it looks like, no matter that you've got blast doors, you've got blast valves, you've got emergency food stored, as long as you're using city water in the city sewer, it's not a shelter. One of my friends visiting in Moscow, they held an orientation meeting down in the basement of the building. It was obviously a shelter. They went through the blast doors to get there. There were the standard louvered air inlet valves. And the woman organizing the tour, my friend asked the question, are there any shelters around? And she says, no, there are no shelters in this city. And was truthful, because no matter what we would think, the fact that this room they were in, which was covered the whole basement floor of the building, it was not a shelter as long as they were using city water and city sewers, by definition. So that is the subterfuge that they used for so long, denying that there was any civil defense shelter program. Right. I asked the question, who approves the shelter design? Well, the civil defense people do. And the architect responsible for that building submits his design, and if it is one of the basic shelters with any one of these 32 variations on individual location, it's automatically approved. I said, who pays for it then? Who pays for it? The using organization of the building has to pay for it. Well, if they're going to pay for it, do they get any say-so in the design or anything? No. They're forced to pay for it, whoever's going to use the building, but they have nothing to say about the design. They have nothing to say about whether the design is adequate for them or not. That is separate. It's done by the Civil Defense Organization, but the user has to pay for it. Along about this time, there was enough interest. I had an inquiry from WGBH public television station in Boston. They've heard about our work on industrial protection of equipment and asked if they could make a documentary of what we had done. So sure, the more publicity the better. So they sent a camera crew out in the commentator, and for about 3 days we showed them around the plant, showed movies that we had made from the field tests that had been conducted. And at that time we had participated in 5 high explosive simulated nuclear events with a whole variety of test equipment and so on. I gave them all of our films, we talked to them, showed them our industrial processes, all the things we did. They were very, very polite, very interested, took all kinds of film and so on. And then took all this material and went away, and it was a long time before we heard from him again. About the same time, we got a invitation or request or what have you to come present the information to Congress. Well, I was feeling real good about this whole program by then. Good, I've got the intelligence community providing information the best they can, anything I ask for. We've got a big public television station interested. They're going to make a documentary. Even Congress is showing some interest in it, ask us to come back and provide information to Congress. And so about this time, down to the point that every tinkerer like myself hates, you have to start writing a report. And when I started writing the report, then you come face to face with all the deficiencies in the information that you have accumulated. You think you have everything you need to write a report, and still you start writing it. And then you find out you didn't ask the right questions, you don't have the right information. So I started another long dialogue through these various intermediaries back to the emigres. And so I would look at a sketch and I would say, how did you fasten the beam to the wall on that? Did you use shear reinforcing rebar? And after a while on that question, I got back the answer. Of course we use shear rebar. Do you think we're amateurs? On another one, they used, one of the peculiarities is the very large amounts of reinforcing steel that they used. Massive amounts according to our use. One way you talk about this is what percent of the concrete is rebar, actually. And normally on a floor like this, you would have 1/4 of 1% rebar in this floor. It's called thermal rebar to keep the floor from cracking and so on. In our very heavy blast-proof construction, we may use up to 3% rebar. That means in a cross-section, for every 100 square inches of concrete, you have 3 square inches of rebar steel. In many of the designs that these emigres were sending to me, you'd have 9, 10, or 11% rebar steel. We just never build things that way. I talk to construction people and I say, how in the world do you get the concrete in and around this massive rebar? One of the things you have to do is get good bonding of the concrete. And so I would ask through the intermediaries, how did you get the concrete in place with so much rebar already there? And the only answer I got back, no problem, we do it. I ask again, do you hand puddle? Do you use vibrators? How do you do this? No problem, we do it. I say, what kind of tests do you run on the concrete? What is it? Is it 3,000 psi concrete? Is it 8,000 psi concrete? Get back. I don't know. It's what comes in the truck. I say, what kind of tests do you do on the concrete? Do you ever take a sample and see how do you even do a simple slump test? I don't know if you construction people know what a slump test is on concrete. One way of testing how much water it is, the more water the weaker it is, the easier it is to get around the rebar. So you want them stiff as possible, as little water as possible. So you do that, you have a little conical bucket. You fill that with concrete, turn it upside down, lift it off, and this cone that you wait to see how far down it slumps. The farther it slumps, that means the more water you've got, the less strength you have. And so to get high strength, you want a very stiff mixture, but then it's very difficult to get that fed down around the rebar. No, we never did slump tests. On the rebar joints, how do you join one rebar to another? Oh, we always weld. Do you ever wire tie? No, we never wire tie. That normally we overlap and wrap them together with wires. You've seen that. They say everything is welded. Why do you always weld? To save rebar. Because with the heavy rebar that they were using, you need 2 or 3 feet of overlap to change the load. So they save a couple of feet of rebar. Is that a real problem? Yes, there's never enough rebar. Why not? I mean, here you're using these large amounts of rebar and you say there's not enough. Well, there never is. You know, well, what do you do when there's not enough to meet the design? Oh, we take the building rebar. I say, you mean you get separate allocation of rebar, one for the shelter, one for the building? That's right. And he said, if you don't have enough, you just take the building rebar? That's right. And in my own mind, this may account for some of the stories we hear about these brand new apartment buildings starting to fall apart so quickly, is that they put all the rebar, which is supposed to go in the building, into the shelter, which is down in the basement. Now, I don't know that that's true. I'm just speculating. What kind of welding do you use? Electric arc welding. Do you use inert gas? What's inert gas? They never even heard of it. For good, strong welds, you bathe your welding area in argon or nitrogen, usually argon gas, to keep oxygen out. You make a stronger weld. Do you do any heat treatment after you make the weld? No. We just make the weld, let it cool down. Do you ever do any testing on the rebar of your weld? Do you ever do any bend tests to see if it'll crack in the bend? No, no test. Why not? It's always good. You know. And so so now I get down to writing a report of making an assessment of how good these shelters are. And the standard way you would make an assessment of this is we have some very elaborate 2D and 3D computer programs, and you put in a model of your structure, the steel and the concrete and the shape and the size and all the rest of it. And you do a finite element analysis, and the computer runs and you get an answer back out. But you need to make some inputs. You need to know how much steel there is and where it's placed. I had a good idea on that. The emigres were pretty good about where the steel had been and how big it was and so on. You need to put in the strength of the steel. I had no idea. You need to put in the yield point. I had no idea. You need to put in the strength of the concrete. How good is that? I have no idea, the strength of the concrete. You need to put in the membrane attachment of the floors to the walls. So I started asking questions, how are the walls made? I should have done that months earlier, and I just hadn't, being a physicist instead of a civil engineer. And came back, we don't know. That wasn't our job. I did the floor, he did the walls, and I don't know who he is now or where he is, and I don't know how we're fastened. So I don't know the membrane stresses. It makes a difference whether something is fastened only on the ends of the beams or whether it's tightly tied all around the end of the membrane. It makes quite a difference in the strength. That's why. So I gave up. I decided I'll make some wild assumptions, and since I'm making wild assumptions to start with, I'll just use nominal value for steel, nominal value for concrete. I'll take the dimensions, I'll believe what the emigres have said, and I'll do some simple load calculations. And so there is a theory, well validated, I thought, because it was in the textbooks and in the handbooks, which says that if you apply a sudden load on a beam and you stress the load to the yield point of the rebar, and your beam bends down, the rebar starts cracking, you get these hairline cracks, but the structure doesn't fail. And to get it to fail, you've got to push it way past the yield point until your concrete starts spalling out, and you lose the rebar concrete beam moments. All right, that takes a load which is in the neighborhood of 6 times the load that brings it down just to the yield point. So that has been verified in many tests. And so I said, okay, that's what I'll do. Makes sense to me. One-time load. So then I started looking at the location of these shelters, and particularly the industrial shelters, which were used, the ones under the buildings are generally 2 stories down, sometimes 3. The ones outside the factories were generally 3 or 4 or 5 floors below ground level. The stairs going down to them are quite extensive. And looking at the information I have and the pictures that I'd gotten from this architect back on the East Coast, putting it all together, I came up with an assessment of what I thought how hard the shelters were. Okay, my numbers, the ones under the tall buildings, the apartment buildings, I came up with a nominal value of about 60 psi, their sure safe value. The ones under the ones that were built for the industrial workers, I came up with a nominal value of about 240 psi, the hardness of the shelter. About this time, Congress said again, they've got an actual time set now for testify before Congress. So 3 of us go back, supervisor and then 2 of us Indians, and we'll go back to Congress, and it's a marvelous experience to go testify before Congress. And mine is not typical, and you'll find out why. But we were met by an escort. I got to go to the underground tunnels back and forth in the Capitol. I got to eat in the Senate cafeteria, have some of their famous menus, a marvelous experience. In the afternoon, we had a 2-hour session that we were going to give our testimony. We went into the conference room, beautiful room, rugs on the floor, nice walnut or mahogany table where the 3 of us were sitting, a microphone before each one. There was kind of like a little balcony up and back, and right on time the committee came in. It was Senator, chairman of the Armed Services Committee was the chairman of the committee, and I don't know the others, didn't get introduced, how many of them were senators, how many Republicans, how many are House members, I don't know. I had happened, just by happenstance before that, to come across a book on body language. And one of the chapters in this book was how to posture yourself in various stressful situations. One of their examples was you've been stopped for speeding. How should you best present yourself when the trooper comes up and says, you know, show me your driver's license? How do you show obedience and respect in the best way? One of the other items was you're called to be a technical expert witness. How should you sit, talk, look, and so on? You know, so okay, I go in, I sit down there, and I put on my best technical expert face expression, my body posture. I look around, and there are TV cameras all over the place. There were 5 of them pointing right at me, all of them with their little red light on. So I sit there trying to look like a technical expert. The committee comes in, they take their seats, and chairman nods, and so the leader of our group, we had prepared a little 2-paragraph summary. He reads the summary, hands it up to the chairman. Okay, the chairman then reads a statement. Goes on and on and on, almost nothing to do with civil defense or anything else. The member over here then reads a statement, and it goes on and on. And the next one goes on and on. I sit there, all 5 cameras, all of them still asking. They all read around. Chairman looks, 2 hours are up, they get up and walk out. I never even gave my name. I never said word 1. My whole experience with testifying before Congress was to sit trying to look intelligent for 2 hours straight and not say a word. They didn't even ask me my name, you know, let alone answer any kind of question. Well, this should have been a clue that somehow the interest in this subject was shifting, you know. Anyway, Just a little while after this, about a couple of weeks, the CIA issued a white paper. And the white paper said, in essence, that after extensive examination of the Soviet system, we now have firm evidence that they have no civil defense shelter program for anyone. A little while after this, the WGBH documentary that they had made came out on TV for an hour program. It was an anti-civil defense broadcast. They had a lot of information talking to the anti-civil defense people. They did show a few clips of the work that we had taken, showing that how foolish this is. I finally got my report together, sent it off to the proper office in Washington, D.C. that monitors these kind of things with my simple-minded approach. The report came back technically unacceptable, that you don't do structural analysis in this simple-minded way. There did come out of this three things I think that were good. One of them, my claims for this factor of 6 and the very hard capability of the Soviet structures. The Waterways Experiment Station, part of the Corps of Engineers, were able to promote a new test facility called GRABS, G-R-A-B-S, the Giant Reusable Air Blast Simulator. This was a very clever idea. It's a giant cylinder, 10 feet across. You fill it with dirt, and before you cover it up in this dirt, you put a scale model of the structure you want to test. The scale model is made very, very carefully. Everything is scaled down very nice. It's made to a fraction of a millimeter precision. Beautiful structures that they make. You then cover it with dirt if that was the one you were to test. And then you have a giant piston above this. And with this piston, which is driven with a hydraulic system, you can simulate the overpressure and the pulse shape of any kind of blast wave that you want to simulate. So they built a number of models of the structures as I had described them in my book, and started running tests on it with the kinds of soil and the depth of cover and so on. And it turned out that the failure point of the structures that they tested ran between 6 and 8 times the calculated elastic limit of the structure. So I felt good about the predictions that I had made. The other thing that came out of it was the CIA apparently weren't too satisfied with their white paper, so they started a on-the-ground search in 3 Soviet cities looking for shelters. And I don't know how their operators worked or so on, but anyway, the reports that started trickling back from that was that they found an average of 2 shelters a day, and it was a linear function. Every day they found, each of the operators found 2 more shelters, and the next day he'd find 2 more, and the next day he'd find 2 more. That they had thought they would find a few and then there wouldn't be any more. They quit the program when they had found enough shelters under the buildings to house 15% of the population in the cities. I have no proof that there were enough shelters for more than 15%, but it was still linear. Every day they would find the same number of new shelters. It was just a matter of walking up and down the blocks on foot looking for the telltale signs. And we provided them with a whole catalog of things you look for to tell if there's a shelter or not. All the shelters in the building are dual use. That means they are used for something. It may be a meeting room, concert hall. They rent them out to businesses. They have their laundry room in the shelter, all kinds of things. When they rent it out to a business to use the shelter, the requirements are that it must be evacuated and turned back into a shelter on 24-hour notice. And so there's not just idle space, they use it all. One other thing that came out of it was there was also interest in the possibility of adding regional defense systems, short-range ballistic missile defense, something that would work against the Scud and so on. The Army was in charge of this, and they started a program, joint program between the Army, some of their research agencies, Sparta Corporation, SAIC, and I was asked from the Boeing company to come provide information on the cost of various kinds of shelters, which I did. And so all of that work went on for most of a year, and we put very good cost information into this study, which is somewhere in the Army archives, because the interest in actually building a defense system has gone downhill since then. It was a fascinating period of time. I had experiences that I enjoy, recalling them. I got to go to Congress. I didn't say much. One of the other things that happened after the CIA paper came out was the volume of Russian reports, which had been coming out of the translation department actually translation are done in DIA, not in CIA, went way down. We'd been getting several reports a week, and it went down to just a trickle. And so this was coincided with the CIA paper that said they don't have an active civil defense program, at least not in shelters. It was quite some time before we found out that this was accomplished by reassigning the translators. And so on. Right. Well, I had a great time with all of this. I have absolutely nothing to show for it. My report was not accepted. The pictures that the gentleman gave to me are locked up in a top secret file somewhere. They were given to me in the open. When this program is all over, it decided they were top secret, and they are locked up in a file somewhere. If I'd have known that was going to happen, I would have made copies and kept them, but I didn't. I did not have much foresight. But I thank you. If there are questions, I'll try to answer them.
Your hearing, your congressional hearing was what date? Was this after Kennedy was dead and Johnson took over and began the antagonism towards civil defense, McNamara?
It was in the McNamara regime, yes. I never did get a hearing with McNamara. I tried desperately hard to talk to the man personally, and I could not accomplish it. I got one briefing to the president, but I could not get it to McNamara. He refused to see anything I would say.
And the president was?
President at that time was Johnson.
Was Johnson, yeah.
Yes.
That's when it began the reversal.
Yeah.
One thing, and then I'll ask a question. I don't want you to despair too much about civil defense in the United States, because most people don't realize that the best shelter anywhere in the world is in this country, in Washington, D.C., under the new Soviet embassy. Better than anything the Swiss or the Swedes or anybody else has. My question.
I would be curious if you have any technical information on how it's constructed.
Yeah.
I do not.
That was largely built by the Soviets. They didn't do it the way we did with our embassy that got filled with microphones.
Are you talking about the new embassy? Or
the new embassy, the one that's, I'm not sure they've even occupied it yet.
Yeah.
My question is this. I think one of the biggest and best kept secrets in World War II was the civil defense in Germany. And this is never discussed. It is not written up anywhere. And yet they were incredibly competent. They were the ones who developed the Luftwaffe and certainly the Blitzkrieg, and they knew what airplanes and bombs could do. I spoke to a gentleman once who was in charge of some big factory in Stuttgart. He had 50,000 employees, and during the 3 years, right in the middle of the war, that he was in charge of the employees, he said not one person was injured by bombing during that era. People would get sick and have other absences, but never did they have an absence due to bomb injury. So they must have had one incredible shelter system. The only information we get from it is the total distortion, of course, about Hamburg and the firestorm. And even there's information now that they had a multi-layered and variable system of shelters. But do you know of anybody who's written about how effective we know that their industrial plants and many of the military targets were incredibly well sheltered. We had one hell of a time attacking them. The only thing I can find is that we concluded, got the cart and the horse reversed, we concluded that our bombing was very ineffective during World War II. And this was the ultimate conclusion, and actually I think the proper conclusion was that their protection was incredibly efficient. Do you have any information on that?
Let me answer this way. I don't know of anything that's been written about this. I had the good fortune to spend 3 years in shape in Europe, and one of my co-workers is a German colonel in the Corps of Engineers who lived through this in Germany, and then before he started working with us on the upgrade of the command control system there, his job following the terms of the surrender was to destroy the shelter system in Germany. And so he has told me in great detail what the shelters looked like, where they were, how effective they were, and what he had to do to blow them up, which was a very, very difficult thing. And he once demolished a whole village when he got the charge big enough to blow up the shelter in it. But I have personal information from this engineer in the German army who worked with me for these 3 years. Took me to many places. I had a marvelous tutor for the German side of the World War II. He was too young to fight, just a boy, but his job post-war put him right in the knowledge. The shelter system was excellent. I know the basic designs of how they did it. I do not have any information personally on the casualties or lack of casualties or so on. I do have some details on the Hamburg system and how effective that was and why there were casualties in the shelter system. Not many, but a few. And that was due to smoke while they were trying to break out after the raid was over to get out of the shelter. They didn't realize that outside was still burning. They could tell the bombs were no longer falling, and so in some places they crashed through the doors, and the smoke and so on then caused casualty. In other cases, they tunneled from one shelter under a building to the shuttle and in the next building. Some cases they tunneled blocks and blocks and blocks before they could find shelters which were under the buildings in Hamburg. And yes, they had shelters everywhere. The whole population was in shelters. Everyone didn't, no, that's not true. Many of them did not get to the shelters. There were a lot of people killed in Hamburg outside the shelters. That was because the raid caught them too far away from the shelter. They didn't get there.
And of course, Martin Caden reported the opposite, that the only people that died were the ones in the shelters.
Some of the people...
The DSR, its whole push.
Okay, some of the people in shelters died, and it was after the raid was over, and they were breaking out, and they broke out into a firestorm. And the ones who took the other approach of trying to find a safe exit all made it. There were no casualties. from the bomb or from the firestorm in any of those shelters.
When are you going to put all this down in the technical report? Because it's not anywhere. I've scoured the literature for decades, and this is some of the most crucial and valuable information around, and you can't find it.
All I can contribute, you see, is hearsay. So while I believe it, it's personal conversations with a German officer who wasn't there either. Yes.
I was privileged to make 2 trips to communist China as an official guest of the government, exchanging Pacific Defense information. And the Chinese, as you know, had an interconnected tunnel system of shelters, all under, I walked a total of miles under 8 Chinese cities, and certainly was impressed by at least that part of it. I wondered if the Russians had, when they were building the shelters you just described, did they interconnect the shelters? And I'm also wondering if the Russians anticipated what happened very recently at Grozny and in other very small cities in Chechnya, in which I've read Reuters reports and all, that the freedom fighters, Chechens, used these their interconnected shelters, and whether they've done that in anticipation of a Russian attack on them, I don't know. But for example, they pop out and kill a Russian soldier, or maybe several of them, or knock out a tank with an RPG-7, and then they wouldn't get killed when the bombing of the Russian planes bombed or the artillery blew the area to pieces. Certainly the Russians didn't anticipate that as the use of the shelters, but did they interconnect purposely?
I have no information on that, Crescent. Yeah, I have no information on that. None of my correspondents knew. I got zero answer to quite a few questions, and that was one of them. Do the shelter under this building connect to the one under the next building and so on? They did not know, the ones who had been involved in the construction. And some of them have been foremen on the construction of the shelter. I don't know.
Well, the mystery's continued. Thank you.